Good morning. Like I said, my name is Conchetta Gibson. I am the president and co-founder of Wild Ones Delmarva chapter. I'm also the founder and principal garden partner at my small business based here in Denton, actually. Garden coaching and consulting. Business is Leaf in Bed. I'm also a plant broker registered with the state, so I can source native plants from different growers that we have locally, as well as different nurseries. So when I started my business about 2.5 years ago, and almost immediately saw that we had a need. People are really interested in learning about native plants and why we should be buying them and how it's going to support wildlife. And so I got a few of my friends together and we're like, let's start this chapter, August of 2024, just so that we can help to spread the word a little bit and get that outreach to folks who might be interested. Okay. So about Wild Ones promotes the use of native plants through local and national education programs, as well as all kinds of other activities. There are chapters all over the US. They're even looking beyond that as well. People have some interest in that. It is the national organization part of the org does a lot of work with national programs as well, and gives a ton of support to the different chapters. So if you're interested in joining, there's a link at the end of the presentation, but you can check out the QR codes and I have a few business cards as well. I will just quickly go through some of the history of things just because it is relevant to what we're doing today, which is talking about how native plants support birds and other wildlife. So Wild Ones actually was started by out of the Audubon Center in Wisconsin. So part of Wild Ones history as an organization is recognizing the importance of native plants in supporting birds as well as sustainable landscaping. Our mission is to promote native landscapes through education, advocacy, and collaborative action. The full vision statements, position statements, values, and such are all listed on the website of Wild Ones if you're interested. There's a big push, a big focus in Wild Ones about biodiversity at all scales with all creatures, including humans. So, partly why Wild Ones thinks that native plants and sustainable landscaping is important for wildlife. We are currently in a biodiversity crisis. It is pretty much consensus across all scientific fields at this point. More than 40% of insect species are declining. And if you've ever driven your car on a highway between here and the beach and not had a ton of bugs all over your car anymore like we used to have, I think that's a pretty good indicator right off the bat, even if you're not out there counting, how many bugs are around, right? We've also lost 2.9 billion birds. That is 29% of the individuals of birds that are out in the wild since 1970. And you might recognize 1970 right around and right before a lot of the environmental law started to happen. And then we enacted laws and we're still losing birds. I'll go through a couple of the drivers that we've seen of why this is happening. One major driver is habitat loss. So when we build something, when we develop something, we have to cut something down, right? We have to get rid of the plants and such that are there. And one thing that we do as a society is cut down stuff, build things, and then do not replace any of the natural stuff that was there, the plants and such, which means that whatever was living there when it was cut down, insects, birds, all of that, now don't have access to that. So we're just reducing that habitat. Related to habitat loss is habitat fragmentation, which is when you develop and you we'll leave some of the nature around, but you cut through roads and driveways and such that makes it so critters can't cross the road without getting killed. Now we have habitat fragmentation where we have these small pieces of habitat that are left that aren't enough to support the actual wildlife that needs to be there. And we don't have connectors. And we'll talk about one way that we can, as individuals, we can help with the habitat fragmentation because it is just as bad as habitat loss when you look at the science behind, what happens to an environment when you start building. In the US, about 100 million acres is national and state parks. 400 million is agriculture. So we're talking like a 1-to-4 ratio. We have a ton of national parks so far. We have a ton of state parks, local parks, right? But all of that is still like a quarter of what we're doing just in agriculture alone through the country. And that's not even considering, the suburban urban landscapes as well. Turf lawns are a big thing too. Businesses, homes, any of that. Um, Lawns have definitely a purpose for what we need. Some plants are better than none, but because a lawn is just a couple, maybe one species, a couple species of turf grasses that we're cutting low all the time, it's really not a habitat anymore. Even though it is a plant, it is still not considered habitat just because it's not supported in a habitat way, right? They are water intensive. People sometimes put in lawns that are uh, dormant in the dry season, in the hot season, and then they try to water their lawn all summer because it's not being green. Like, okay, well, the species is going to be dormant no matter what, right? So sometimes it's the choice in species and then how that affects the maintenance. It's time intensive. You got to pay someone to cut it, right? It's money. Or you do it yourself. And it can be chemical intensive if you want just lawn, no weeds. If you want that pristine, 1950s sort of look. They are sterile places, and if you're treating with chemicals and such, they are toxic places as well for the environment. So another issue. I don't have a ton. There is a number as far as lawns go. But my understanding is like a property owner will spend 10 to 20% of the value of their home on landscaping. And that typically what we're talking about these days, especially with new construction and people who maintain a lawn, is going to be a lawn, right? So some of those big drivers, there's a couple other drivers as well. But those are big ones that are relevant to our discussion today here. So why are native plants going to help with any of this? So what is a native species? There are a ton of different definitions. If you ask, 3 scientists what a native species is, you'll get probably 4 or 5 different answers. What I like to use definition wise is something that is a species that has been in a habitat, in an ecosystem long enough that it's developed relationships with other species that have been in that ecosystem for a long time as well. Thinking about it from relationships. One of the other definitions is like, oh, anything before European colonial settlers came. Like, okay, but the landscape was still managed by indigenous people too. So if we're taking an anthropogenic perspective, we can use that definition. But scientifically, when we're talking about, healing up ecosystems, those relationships is really the key. If you take out a food source, that's going to affect anything that eats that food source because you've ruined sort of that relationship there. A lot of the relationships often become specialized as well. Think about like monarch butterflies and milkweed. You hear that one a lot, where milkweed actually has a toxin that only some species can tolerate in their systems, and monarchs happen to be one of them. One way that monarchs signal to the environment, like, hey, I'm toxic from the milkweed, is by being orange. And then you have a couple, I think the viceroy butterfly, and there's a couple other butterflies that are also look orange to pretend like they're monarchs, even though they're not toxic. So you have all these different relationships and connections that start to happen, and they do become very specialized in different ecosystems. There are generalists as well, and typically when you see habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, the generalists, which are species that can kind of poke around and have relationships with different sort of species, so that if 1 or 2 things goes out of that ecosystem, they can kind of tolerate a little bit, which is why you see even in developed landscapes some native species still being able to be around because they're not as specialized. But what happens is anything that was specialized, that had those very specific relationships and like gentle balances, those species are no longer in the habitats. Also, you want to consider native to where, especially if you're thinking about native plants and getting some of the plant tags will say US native. Like, cool, that's great. Like the desert native, maybe that's not going to survive in Maryland, right? If it is state native, Maryland has the coastal plain, it has the Piedmont, and it has the mountains. 3 very different climate regions there, ecoregions we refer to them as. Something that grows well in the mountains may not grow well in sandy, slightly brackish soil, right, that we have here. So you want to consider native to where, and all the different levels, I guess, of where is it native to is important, because you can't always buy one plant that is native to, Caroline County and that's it. It doesn't grow anywhere else. A lot of times they're not in production for you to buy anyway. So you want to be a smart consumer as you're reading through the tags and just be sure of what you're actually buying. So now, why native plants? The baseline for birds in particular is that birds rely on their ecosystems. Ecosystem is full of habitat. Plants make up habitat. So without the proper habitat species of plants, the birds don't get what they need. These plants provide cover, and other plants can provide cover, they provide nesting materials. Some non-native plants can provide some appropriate nesting materials, maybe. Food. Birds they're gonna be eating seeds, right? They're gonna be eating the critters that eat the plants. If you take out and don't have native plants that have a specialized relationship with some of those insects that the birds need, now the birds don't have that food source anymore. That's kind of the baseline specifically to birds, but generally across the ecosystem. Plants are alive, they're life, they have relationships with other organisms and have important ones. They rely on insects to pollinate them too. So if something happens to an insect that a bird needs, let's say we pull out that food source, that plant also can't pollinate itself and can't grow again. So eventually those plants, their life cycles are going to cycle out, they're going to die, and they're not going to be reproducing. With native plants, they really provide the vital relationships that non-native species cannot fill. Clover, the bees will eat it. Sure, they'll eat the nectar. Is it like going to McDonald's and not quite like having a nice full meal, like home-cooked meal? Yeah. And that clover is not going to support all the other species that the birds and the plants are going to need as well. So these specialized vital relationships are really key for native species because they all have those relationships to make up that ecosystem. Without those relationships, when you pull key pieces out, now your ecosystem can collapse. So to support birds as individual human beings here, we need to support the life that's around them, right? We can get bird seed, we can build nesting, nest houses and all of the, bird boxes and such. But if we're not supporting all of the life stages and all the needs of birds, it's only going to be band-aids on top of, a collapsing system. That's going to include insects, it's seeds and seed heads, it's stems for the critters that need to nest in the wintertime in a stem, right? Some of the non-native grasses, birds might be able to use some of that as nesting sources, but some of the stems that their insect food needs can't nest inside of it, right? And then nectar and pollen as well. And nectar and pollen have chemical makeups, right? And each of the nectars and pollens have different chemical makeups just because they're from different species. And those set of nutrients in native plants are the sets of nutrients that our native species need. And non-native species may not have that same set of nutritional value. More benefits of native plants. They are going to restore vital ecosystems. So if we're putting the puzzle pieces back together, we're going to have a rebalanced ecosystem that's going to fully support itself. When a hurricane comes through and knocks out a quarter of the plant life, the rest of it's still going to be able to survive because we haven't taken out these key pieces. We're putting those back together, and that way it can continue to thrive and grow from there. They're a big part of the solution to climate change as well as the weather changes, as the climate changes. Plants that are native are naturally adapted to what we have here. And so when big changes and fast changes happen, they already have a head start into changing with the weather, if that makes sense. They're resilient and adapted to regional soil as well. So soil chemistry is key. When you have non-native plants, what plants do is they take things in from their roots, and then they also expel other things they don't need out of their roots. If you have non-native plants, they're going to be expelling things into the soil that is going to change the soil chemistry, which means the biology is going to be changing in the soil, which means the nutrient profiles change. And then it makes it potentially soil that our native plants can't tolerate anymore, at least the more sensitive ones. They also mitigate stormwater runoff. They reduce erosion by, in both of those cases, the roots are holding the soil together. The stems themselves are slowing down the stormwater, the rain that's running off, so it doesn't just, carry all the pollution and all the soil directly into the water. If you're planting them at the appropriate spacings that our native plants like, they're going to be helping to slow that water down and let it soak back into the groundwater so that we have our groundwater recharging and clean. And then they also support healthy economies. If you think about all the species that can live in native plants, they're going to also be pollinating the fields that we have, right? If our honeybees can pollinate fields, sure, but they are not a native species, and they are generalists, which means that they can just kind of go wherever. I did just see actually in Europe, the honeybee is officially now endangered status in Europe, even though they're native there, right? So everything's relative as to what's native and what's happening where, right? But the honeybees can't pollinate every crop. Insects are they pollinate the shape of flower that they can get into. So your big bees can get, bumblebees, carpenter bees and such, they can get into the real big flowers and buzz the flower and shake the pollen so that it pollinates. But any flowers that are sort of tubular shaped really relies on something with a long tongue. So a butterfly, a moth, a long-tongued bee, right? So if we only have honeybees, there's only a certain sector of agricultural crops that are going to be able to be pollinated. We need that biodiversity to get all of the crops pollinated, right? And then the nursery industry as well. Like I said, the landscaping industry, whatever, 10 to 20% of what you're paying for your house is going to go to your landscaping. And so if you're buying just turf grass and fertilizer and all of that, you get one benefit. It looks nice. If you decide to go with native plants with sustainable landscaping, you're spending money on the native plants and supporting the native plants in a way that not only looks nice, and they can look nice and they don't have to look messy. That's a thing that I work a lot with clients, is how to make it not look like a messy meadow if you don't want that look, or if your neighbors might not want that look, right? And then buying those native plants, you're supporting mostly small businesses that are local, because native plants are very more on the local scale. So you're supporting local growers, local nurseries that then can make more production to get more native plants out into the environment, get new species, right? So lots of economic money reasons too. Just that plants as habitat, because plants form the foundation of a habitat, they also form the foundation of the food web. So it's one thing if you're killing your wasps all the time, right? That's not good for the pests that they're going to be eating from you. Sometimes it's a safety issue for sure. But if you take the wasps out of the environment, it may have a lesser impact than if you take the plants out of the environment, because everything that relies on the plants all the way, up and around the food web is now impacted by just that one action. And I know we switched from food chain to food web, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. I was teaching in the classroom around when it happened. The food chain leads you to believe that it's linear, whereas the food web really shows all the different relationships that are around. So we tend to use that terminology. Plants are consumed by herbivores, critters that eat plants and plant parts. A vast majority of those are going to be insects, right? And then what eats the insects? The birds and other wildlife, ticks and mosquitoes, you're talking possums and raccoons and such. And then what eats those, right? And then when they're defecating into the soil, when they die, now they put those nutrients back into the soil. The decomposers get to them, break it down and make them into nutrients, right? And then those nutrients are used by plants all over the place. So it really is a big web of all these interconnected relationships. All the lines between the different organisms are those relationships in ecology. Plants, you can categorize them into contributors, into non-contributors, and detractors into the food web. So some plants are in the food web and they are really contributing a lot of different ecological services. Some plants are there and they don't have as many relationships that are promoting and regenerating other species. Those would be a lot of your like non-native plants where they're just kind of there. Nothing can really eat them, but they're not hurting anything either, except the soil chemistry, but we don't have to get nitpicky. And then the detractors, those are going to be a lot of your invasive plants where in the environment, they are negatively contributing to the environment. They are taking up habitat space. They are pulling nutrients. They're aggressively going after other plants, something like an English ivy versus a Virginia creeper. So English ivy, when it's crawling up trees and such, it puts its roots in through the bark into the centers of the trees where disease and such can be spread into the tree. And they're strangling, they're pulling nutrients, they're potentially, moving diseases into trees. And that's why they tend to kill them versus Virginia creeper, which is aggressive, but it is native. It grows very quickly, but it doesn't get its roots into the trees. So it's not actually like hurting the trees. They're sort of in that sort of non-contributor relationship with the tree. And they do actually fruit and have some other benefits for the environment, right? So thinking about all the different levels of relationships and what they're doing, when you add one thing, when you take away one thing, what are all the different things that change then? Larval host plants, we hear host plants a decent amount. We mentioned, or I mentioned earlier that a lot of these relationships are specialized, right? Native plants a lot of them serve as a host plant for very specific insect larvae. When you're thinking about native plants and supporting the ecosystem, you want to think about supporting all of the different times in a critter's life, in a bird's life. So they're in an egg, they need a nest. They're babies, they need certain kinds of food when they're babies. They get raised by the adults, then they become adults, and then they eat different food. So, and then with insects themselves, their eggs, they need to be laid on something. The insect eggs will then hatch. Their larva is going to eat whatever it's on. If it eats what it's on, but the plant that it's on does not provide that nutrient profile that it needs, it's not going to survive to adulthood. So something like a butterfly bush, people love butterfly bush and it attracts so many butterflies. And then they lay their eggs on those butterfly bush and then none of their larvae can eat the butterfly bush when they hatch. And then you lose entire generations of insect larvae. Even though they're attracting the butterflies, thinking about the whole lifespan is really key. So if you have certain birds that eat certain insects, what do those insects need from the plant world? That's what you can put into your yard. So it takes a little bit of research that way, but thinking about it, systematically. So specialization is that, those very specialized relationships over long periods of time, the specialization process will happen where like, one critter is just really, really supported by this one plant. And over time, they just stay on that plant. And over generations, their gut biomes and such start to not be able to tolerate other plants, right? So we talked about butterflies and milkweed. So the adult monarch butterfly there finds the food, goes, this is great food. I'm going to lay my eggs here because I don't want to waste a lot of energy. And then their larvae, because it's the milkweed, can tolerate the milkweed and then survive from there. There's a bunch of different other kinds of critters. A lot of I talked earlier a little bit about flower shape, right? So if you are specialized to a certain shape of flower, if you have a bird species that likes to eat a lot of butterflies, they have long tongues, which means they need some of the tubular shaped flowers to be able to eat. And so that's when you want to consider, okay, what tubular shaped flowers are there? Milkweed is one, phlox is one, coral honeysuckle is one. There's a ton of options there once you have a little bit of background and baseline for what you want to attract in your yard. Um, Dr. Doug Tallamy, who a lot of us know in the plant world, I think he's still working with University of Delaware, even though he lives up in PA. He has a bunch of different books and such that are all amazing. But in Nature's Best Hope, he shares that one of the big mistakes in our approach to conservation is that the idea that nature is something separate, right? We are separate than nature. If we are separate than nature, then why are we taking out nature to build right in the middle of it, right? No, we are part of it. As soon as we start to impact those relationships that are in nature, we now become part of that ecosystem. We become a factor of relationship in there. We can be contributors, non-contributors, or detrimental in those spaces too. So where do we start? Where can we as individual people who just have a Saturday afternoon free start? Planting plant corridors, so connections between the habitat pieces that we have fragmented, that's where our gardens can really make a big difference. It seems like a very small thing, but if every single one of us planted like a 5-8 foot strip, garden bed that connects between the backyard and the front yard, and maybe your backyard goes into some woods. Now anything that can get across the front street, maybe over trees, goes into your garden bed and then follows that corridor back and then connecting into that other habitat. So what can we do in those spaces? Removing your invasive plants because the critters are not going to use those as corridors. Reducing your lawn. There's a time and a place for lawn. We have kids, we have dogs, we need those spaces. Do we need an acre of lawn? Probably not. We could probably get away with something a little smaller than that. If you want to change your whole lawn, I'm all about it. But you can also just reduce it and strategically place the other plantings to connect those habitats. Planting a butterfly garden. So know what butterflies you want to attract that'll support the different birds that you want, and then figure out what species they need. And then go to the plant store with your Latin names and go, this is what I want. And if you don't have it, order it for me. They want your money. They will do that. They will order it for you. You can plant a rain garden if you've got like muddy spots, wet spots, low spots in your yard. It's really not great lawn there anyway because it's muddy and gross, right? So you can plant a formal rain garden, which has different layers under the ground as well. Or you can cheat a little bit and just get water-loving species and then plant like a little garden bed. That'll get you most of the way there to a rain garden, unless you've got like a larger space that you need to calculate volumes of rainwater and such. But most of the time, just a quick solution is figuring out some of those water-loving plants that are native that'll support your birds. And then plant an oak tree. Oak trees support the most number of species in one tree than any other plant. And any kind of oak tree. We've got a lot of different kinds of oak trees that are native here. I know white oak is one that people talk about a lot. There's pin oaks, there's willow oaks that, look sort of like willow trees, like the leaf shapes, right? There's black oak, there's red oak, there's tons of options. If you have room for a full tree, if you don't, maybe consider a smaller shrub too. Maybe a couple of those, maybe a diversity of those to start supporting different kinds of insects. Dr. Tallamy says every bit of conservation we do outside of a park helps conservation inside of a park. And you can plant now. Fall is a great time to plant. We're getting towards the end of nursery availability. As far as end of the growing season for nurseries, and middle to end of October here, but there's still a lot that are around. Fall is a great time to plant. Spring is a great time to plant. And then even some of your early bloomers to support your early emerging insects in, late February, early March. Species start to become available as well. You want to think about the species. You also want to think about how densely you want to plant. Native plants can be spaced at 12-inch spacing, and some of them may not survive over the long term, but the ones that do survive are going to be the ones that are spreading naturally. And so if you're willing to do that up front, to plant really densely, then the plants will come to an agreement all on their own of where they need to be and how far spaced out they need to be and where they're going to put their seeds. So if you lose one individual plant, it already probably went to seed and you're going to get more of them somewhere else in that garden space. If you're concerned about people thinking that your yard is a mess, you can put what we call cues to care. There's a tons of different signs that you can get that says, hey, this is like a real thing and I'm taking care of it, I swear, even just like edging, the little fencing, little borders, just cues that like, oh, this is an intentional space. And then those can also increase the aesthetics of your garden as well. You also want to consider budget. Are you buying seed because you're in it for the long haul and you're going to take care of it to grow them? Or are you going to buy plugs, which are the little plants? The foliage is real small, but the roots are really dense and they're usually cheaper, but they take longer usually to show. Do you want bigger plants because you want it to look like something and you need all that root space and shading of those plants to shade out your weeds quicker? So considering that with your budget. And then what your timeline is, how long before you need the garden to look like something. And that may just be you need it to look like something so that your HOA doesn't get upset with you, right? So all these things to think about. You can plant in the bed you already have. You want to consider when you're pulling things out. If you're going to replace a tree, don't do it during a nesting season because there may be a nest up in there. And when you pull a plant out, be ready to replace it right away, or else you're going to get bare spots. You'll get the weeds that come in, and then you're just battling weeds while you're trying to put new plants in too. So in and out pretty quick. You can make new beds using that cardboard method where you either use cardboard or tarp to smother grass, throw compost on top. The cardboard can actually stay. Once it's soft enough, you just plant right through the cardboard and you're good to go. And then with a tarp, you just pull the tarp, shake the compost onto the soil, and now you've got a brand new garden bed. And you can also, there's a couple different tests of your soil if you're not sure what how healthy, how balanced in nutrients and life in your soil you actually have. You can get a lab test. You can also search online for like texture tests to see like how much sand do I actually have in this. Typically around here on the shore, the first 6 inches of soil is going to be sand and loam, either more sand or more loam. And then about 7 to 8 inches down, the clay starts. And our native plants love that. If you're in a development where they have taken off the top layer of soil for like new construction, you might just start at the clay. And we have a whole list of native plants that love that. So you can always find something for the soil that you have. And if I haven't said it enough, research is going to be important. Know what birds you want to attract. Figure out what they eat. Figure out what they need for nesting. What spots, what locations, what materials. And then figure out what those insects need to survive. And that's going to be your plant list. And then be a conscious consumer. The more Latin names, scientific names you can use with a nursery, the better. I called a nursery and asked for tall coneflower. So tall coneflower is the common name for a very specific Latin name, but they thought I was just talking about a tall coneflower, like just a small coneflower that happened to be tall, right? So be a smart consumer there when you're researching. Use the Latin names, give them the Latin names because that's what they're going to use to search for their inventory. Read your labels. If you're getting real deep into it, the EPA Ecoregion Level 3 is the most helpful in choosing plants. We are in the Maryland coastal plain here in Denton, and most of, or if not all of the Eastern Shore here. So that'll help in the level 3. That's the coastal plain designation there. And you can always ask your nurseries about their pesticide use. Put them on the spot, ask them. And if they can't answer your question, you don't want to necessarily buy plants from someone that's using pesticides that gets into the plants and then gets eaten by the insects and then gets eaten by the birds, right? So I've got a bunch of different resources. I'm also happy to share the PDF if anyone is interested in clicking through any of these things. We also have the recording here. So that's the end of my slides. Any questions? Yeah.
Lot of inches in my yard, flowers. Can I help them down? Because a lot of places, like say that they are provide the sewers, yeah, and then also scan bees by
Yeah. So the question I'll repeat just so or online here. The question is purple coneflowers. The goldfinches love them. Can you cut down the coneflowers at some point during the season? Does it make sense to do that? Is that, what is the environmentally sustainable way of supporting? So the seed heads, they need to be mature seeds for them to be able to eat the seeds, right? Coneflower, the seed heads tend to stay as long as, they don't get blown over. So they'll last an entire winter, which makes it a good winter food source for the goldfinches. So my recommendation is usually just leave them, because what happens with the stems is that when the seed heads are spent, when they're eaten, when they blow over in a storm, the stems are hollow, which is where the nesting bees and the nesting insects need to overwinter. And so nature, our storms, our weather, that's going to naturally open up the stems. So you don't necessarily need to let me cut down half of them so that, half whatever. So, in the spring, what I usually do, because the critters that are in the stems it's not gonna be safe for them to emerge until the nighttime temperatures are warm enough, because they're not just gonna go hide in the ground in the meantime. They're gonna stay in the stem. So what I usually do is and for any plants, when the new growth starts, that's when I drop the stems. And I just drop them in place. That way the critters have a little bit of insulation, and then they can crawl out whenever they want to crawl out. So I know they say at least 55 degrees at nighttime or whatever. I can't keep track of that. So exactly, we get warm days, cold days. Yeah, yeah. So that's usually how I handle those.
Yeah. Tidy.
Get over and eating tidy.
Leave it there.
Yes. And if anyone else who looks at your property that may have a say in what you're doing sees that it's not neat and tidy, you can always drop the stems and make a pile out of sight, somewhere else. I mean, the same thing with leaves. I know some people get concerned about leaving the leaves for ticks and other critters and for fire potentially. But they don't have to stay right there. You can leave them somewhere else, and just kind of put them there. And now they've got their own little nursery back there. And then your front doesn't look like, quote, a mess, I guess.
Like just literally the top stem off and let it right there in a pot.
Yep.
And then and I figure, the birds will get to it, and then the rest of them must eat different ways.
Yeah, pointing all directions. Yeah. The comment was, just cutting half of the seed heads, dropping them where they're at, and leaving the rest of the 2/3. Like I said, I'm a very lazy gardener, so I'm just letting nature kind of do its thing. We get enough storms, enough wind that I personally am not going to bother with it. If your property is really protected and all the seed heads stay up, then that's cool too. Great. Then you can manage how you need to. I also don't know bird behavior as well. Will the birds eat seeds if they're already on the ground? So something to consider. I don't know how picky some species are of if it's on the ground, it's not edible anymore. It might vary individual to individual bird. It might vary species to species. So perfect. Okay. So there are full ground feeders and such. So yeah, all these things to consider as you're thinking about what birds you want to support, really dig into their life cycles a little bit and see what they want and need.
And I just wanted to mention too, in May, on May 16th, if anybody wants to see kind of what wild gardens look like when they're mature, we got how to tour 2 gardens in Easton, one in some at Jim Turner's house, which is her gardens kind of wild, and then her neighbor about a block away has a garden that's a little more manicured and organized. So we're going to be touring both with the Aspiring, and they're going to talk to us a little bit about what their experience with that.
Yeah, the comment here, May 16th, put it on your calendar. We've got a double garden tour, one of a native garden that's really wild and rewilded, and another one right after that is more manicured, but with native species. So that'll be on the calendar soon. Any other questions? I don't see any in the chat. Yeah.
You mentioned for the coneflowers, so we don't need to, if you're so the stems will be available for the bitters. But there's no other plants that is particularly recommended to me that nature said it is. Hey, here I'm
Yeah, the question is, do you really need to cut the seed heads off? If you have a property where somehow the seed heads make it the entire way through like October, whatever, July to February, then good on you. Absolutely. Maybe go through and clip some of them off. But generally, we get it. We get enough. If nothing else, rainstorms in the wintertime where the wind will knock some of those over. I mean, if you go by and just slap a couple off too, I don't think it's not going to be upset, So,
The native plants that have seeds, could we also gather some seeds to plant other places? And when's the best time? I guess now would be the time to gather the seeds, but do we need to like refrigerator or do anything like that? And then when should we plant?
yeah. So the question is,
I'm thinking about
ironweed. Okay. So the question is, can we harvest our seeds? When do we do that? When do we plant them? Do they need to be refrigerated? All of that. So the question is, the answer is it depends on the species. So I like to take cues from nature, even if I can't find the answer Googling. Is everyone familiar with aster plants? Lots of ray-shaped flowers in the sunflower family. Has anyone experienced when they flower, they start to like droop and flop and then hit the ground, and then that's where their seeds are? That's on purpose. That is an evolutionary process where the height of the seeds, they are specifically designed where they're either going to get quote pruned by deer going through. So when we're pruning plants, it's actually like we're grazing animals or something, right? They're either going to get pruned and not be floppy, or they're going to stay and be floppy. And when they flop where the seed heads are, or the seeds are far enough away. So now that they have good spacing for the new plants. That's why they do that, really. That's why sunflowers do that, the same thing. I mean, it's annoying that they flop, but that is how they spread over time. So you can gather seeds. When you start to see the seeds being mature, that's the time when they need to be planted. So for an aster plant, they do that about this time of year. And then those seeds sit until next year. To me, that indicates it needs a few months of cold in order for that seed to germinate. So taking hints and clues, even if you can't find the answers, you can observe your plants, talk to people and see what they've seen and make some good guesses. So the best time to harvest the seeds is when they look like they're going to be dropping. That's the best time to harvest and probably the best time to plant. Even if they don't need the cold season, it's a lot easier just to plant them wherever instead of going to put them in your fridge or saving them until later, trying to guess and research. Now, why would you put them in the fridge? Some plants need a certain number of cold days, cold months, in order for those seeds to be able to open up so they can germinate. So some people force that by putting them in your fridge. That's a great way to do that. Again, I'm a lazy gardener, so I'm just taking them and then I'm planting them right away. If you want to save them for a season or two because you're not sure where they're going to go, double check. The term is called cold stratification. That's the number of cold days that they're going to need if they need cold stratification. So ironweed, I can't remember if it needs cold stratification, but you can search it and see, and it'll tell you how many, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever. So, yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you all so much. This was lovely.